Today we're going to talk about how this 8 megapixel 16-year-old camera that you can marry in certain states is still better than the Sony a7R III that we got right here. So let's get right into that video. But today we're going to talk about the Canon 1D Mark II, which is a camera that I always, kind of wanted to get because it's just like such an iconic camera. When I first got into photography, I would watch, videos of like Peter McKinnon, and he was like shooting with the Canon 1D cameras. So I always wanted to get one of these cameras, and I finally got one, a couple of months back, if you saw my unboxing video. But it's been a while since I got the camera, so I had a lot of time to experiment around with it. To be honest, I just haven't had that much time to use it because because of COVID, I just, because I want to do like a lot of portrait sessions to see, how this camera actually fares between like a Sony a7R III, but I haven't had that much time, but I did have a couple of times where I had the opportunity to do it. So we're going to talk about it in this video about those times. So when I say this camera is better than Sony a7R III, I actually mean better. Like when it comes to the image quality, I would say subjectively this camera is better than the Sony a7R III, and there's multiple reasons for that. Now by better, I don't mean, there's more detail or there's more dynamic range. This camera has a, pretty old sensor. This is a crop frame camera. The a7R III is a full frame camera. This is I believe it's like an APC-H. So it's like a little bigger than the APC cameras, but honestly, the dynamic range of this camera is not that good, especially if you're shooting RAW with this camera and you try to like lift those shadows. They're all just like green, The camera doesn't, preserve that much data with it. God, I almost threw up in my mouth. But what is good about this camera that looks better than the Sony a7R III that we're going to talk about? Which there's two main factors that I think make this a better camera than the Sony a7R III in certain aspects. Which the first one we're going to talk about is the nostalgia factor. Now, a lot of people, when they think about like a nostalgic like camera look, they always think about like film, because before we were shooting digital, we were shooting with film cameras. Even though film does have some, advantages over digital, which is, I don't even know if it's really true anymore, but film had a lot of dynamic range, which is that like cinematic look that people look for, the highlight roll off and everything. But nowadays, I think the digital cameras are good enough that you can kind of, like, I don't know which one has better dynamic range. Like, if you get the top of the line digital camera, I'm sure you can keep up with the top of the line film camera back in the day, But the reason why I think this camera does have a nostalgic factor to it is that this camera has its own look compared to like the Sony a7R III. If you take a picture with both of these cameras, they look pretty different. Which I can't really say with the newer cameras. With the newer cameras, if you get the the newest Canon camera or the Sony camera or the Nikon or the Fuji or Olympus or whatever, they all pretty much look the same. There's differences in the color science, but they all pretty much look the same nowadays. But if you go back to this camera, it does look different, which is one of the reasons why I think a lot of people like the look of this camera. And since this camera came out in 2004, which was, 16 years ago now, which, is crazy to think about, but, since that is 16 years, when you think back onto like older pictures, a lot of people in my age, like I'm 25 years old, this look that comes out of this camera is a nostalgic look, because this is the camera that professionals used back in the day. And nowadays, if you shoot with this camera, a lot of like when you see those photos, your brain kind of just like associates it with a professional look, because when you're growing up, those were the pictures you saw. So you just think that, oh, a picture comes out of this is a professional picture. While compared to this camera, I don't know, all the pictures just kind of look digital and like over sharpened to me, which is the second reason we're going to get into, which is the megapixel count. Now, this camera is an 8 megapixel camera, which sounds, incredibly low nowadays, but honestly, for a lot of situations, that's all you need. Especially when you're shooting portraits. Like, one thing that I can't complain enough with this Sony a7R III camera is that even though I do use this photo for, taking portraits and doing like corporate headshots or whatever, this is not the camera for it, honestly. The 42 megapixels is way too much to take a picture of a human's face, especially if you're like shooting with like female models. Like I would take a picture with this camera, I'd be like, oh my god, look at the detail in this photo, and the girls would be like horrified because it just has so much detail that like it like points out those like features on your face that like you didn't even know you have. Like you take a picture with this camera, you know, with 8 megapixels, you get a clear image of the person's face, you know. 8 megapixels is enough to get like a sharp image of anything pretty much. But when you introduce something like a 42 megapixel image, now it's like, oh, remember that pimple that you popped in the morning? Then that shows up, you know. If you have like a little wrinkle on your face, that shows up. So this ends up showing you a lot of extra detail that is completely unnecessary. And if I take a picture with this camera, I do have to like spend a good amount of time in post-processing, you know, smoothing out the model's face, you know, getting rid of any pimples or whatever. I mean, it is cool that you get all that detail, but honestly, if you don't need the detail, then it just creates extra work and honestly makes the picture look a lot worse. But combined with the nostalgia factor and that I would say like a dreamy look from like a low megapixel camera, because it just gets a clear image of a person's face without the unnecessary detail, you get a better image if you're taking a portrait of someone. Doesn't mean there's no reason to have a high megapixel camera. For example, if you're doing landscapes, I would definitely use this picture over this because you're just gonna get more detail. But honestly, I took some landscape pictures with this photo, which I took a picture of this sunset picture that I'm showing you guys right now. And people love that photo. And it's not just because, you know, it was just a beautiful sunset, but because of how this camera captured it with the color science and everything. It just looked incredible. Like, I didn't even do any editing to this photo, pretty much. I think I just did, you know, a couple, like, clarity and, like, just very light post-processing to it, and it just looks amazing out of the camera. But if I took the image with this camera, there would be more detail to it. But I think this camera just gives it more, again, more of a dreamy look to it. So I don't know, I think for landscapes, it's always nice to have that, you know, extra detail that you get out of a high megapixel camera. But there is something to be said about shooting with an older camera with lower megapixels, just to get that dreamy look with it. Again, there's other types of photography, like if you're doing product photography, you want much detail as possible. If you're shooting, you know, real estate, you want that detail. But again, it depends on what you're shooting for. But for portraits, these low megapixel cameras are pretty amazing, which is one of the reasons why I actually kind of want to get a Sony a7S III just to take portraits with it, because that's the 12 megapixel camera. So comparing that camera to the a7R III I think would be an interesting video. But again, it's a $3,000 camera that I don't want to spend the money for right now, because I'm just not making money from photography right now. But once I get back into it, I think that's a camera that I do want to at least try out. Maybe I'll rent it for a video, just to see how it fares up to even this camera and then to the a7R III, which is a 42 megapixel camera. Another thing that I do love this camera, which is gonna sound nerdy to do, but it's just like the mechanical feel of it, you know. First of all, the body just feels amazing on this camera. Like, this camera is like made to be like comfortable, and it's just built like a tank. Like, if I just like, I don't want to drop it, but I'm gonna drop it very lightly. Like this is a fucking tank, dude. Like, you're not gonna like break this camera. Like, I got this camera used for like $200, and the only like, there's like not even like a scratch on it. Like, the only thing that sucks about it is that this door is missing on the camera. Let's see if we can 20 north up this. There we go. This door is missing on the camera, and I could not find a replacement door for it. If you guys find it, just let me know, because I do need the door, because this camera is very weather sealed. But if this door is exposed, then that messes up the weather sealing, so you can't use it in the rain, really. But normally, if you have that door, then this camera is completely weather sealed. This camera is very cheap to buy right now. That's one of the reasons why I would recommend you buy it immediately. You know, I got this camera for $200 on KEH.com, but you can also find it around that price on eBay, so make sure to keep an eye look, because I guarantee these cameras are gonna start going up once people realize the nostalgic look that comes out of these cameras are what people want. And just another thing that I love about this camera is just the sound of the shutter. Here, let's do a test now between the shutter sounds between this camera and the Sony a7R III. I don't know, just there's just like something amazing about the, oh god, the buffer's full. Which, let's get to the first negative, the buffer of this camera. Now, for a sports camera, having a long buffer is very important, because, you know, you're gonna wanna, because you're gonna be constantly shooting, you know, you're gonna be like getting in the action. But the thing about this camera is that since it is an older camera, it uses the older CF cards that are just not that fast, and the storage is not that great on them. So the buffer on this camera is terrible, you know, especially if you're doing like wildlife shooting. It's just annoying because you'll be shooting for like a little bit, and then it just, you know, stops and then slows down. It does clear it out kind of fast, but again, compared to the cameras nowadays, the buffer on these cameras are pretty ridiculous. Especially if you look at the newer Canon cameras, those have like, you know, infinite buffers. You cannot fill the buffers on those cameras. The Sony A7R III, I do fill it sometimes, but again, that's a 42 megapixel camera. But I rarely ever fill it really, unless if I'm like shooting really fast and I'm trying to like capture like a bird doing something crazy or something, you know, I rarely ever fill the buffer on those. But with this camera, I fill it up all the time. And even though this is a sports slash a wildlife camera, because it does have that really fast shutter speed that, you know, is pretty much the same as the Sony A7R III that I got right here. It's just the 8 megapixel I just don't feel is enough for shooting wildlife. You know, if you get a clear like image of the animal like just head on, then you can get away with it. But what I feel is that when I shoot wildlife, I do a lot of cropping with the camera, because you can always get closer to the animal. I feel like, you know, especially even when I'm shooting with like 600mm lens, a lot of times I'm still not close enough to the animal. So having that, you know, extra range with the Sony A7R III where I can, you know, crop in afterwards like 2 to 4 times, it does give you that flexibility of, you know, being able to capture the animal without having to be so close up to them. Another thing that's really annoying with this camera is that everything is like a two-hand operation. Like with the Sony A7R III, like if I want to change the ISO on the camera, you know, I just go here, I just click on the ISO button, and then I can just roll my finger and change the ISO to whatever I want. And also I can set the ISO to automatic, and then set the parameters on it so that I'm not going too high on the ISO or I'm not going too low. But with the but with the Canon 1D Mark II, you cannot do that. There's no auto ISO setting, which means that you constantly have to change your ISO depending on how the lighting conditions are changing. But if you're shooting with flash, that's not going to be a problem, which is great. But if you're shooting with natural light, this camera is kind of annoying to shoot with, because you do have to like set all these settings individually. You can't set the you can do like an aperture priority or shutter priority mode, but you cannot set the ISO automatic. So sometimes you just have to put the ISO on high just to like be able to shoot with this camera. But I don't know, it's just really annoying to do. And this camera is terrible in low light. I would even say it's terrible in like medium light, because if you're just shooting indoors with like with like the windows up, like it's still like it's really hard to capture an image with this camera. If you're even if you're shooting with like an f2.8 lens like this, like I have this 100mm f2.8 macro lens, which is a great combo with this camera if you're doing portraits, or you can also do product photography with it. But honestly, it's just kind of annoying nowadays, because we're just like so spoiled with these like newer cameras that do amazing in low light. I can pretty much like see through the night with this camera, you know. I just set an automatic ISO and then it's just able to like shoot it. But with this camera, you kind of have to have good lighting conditions, or just use flash with your camera. But anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was informative. Again, I recommend, if you're interested at all to get this camera, get it now, because I guarantee the prices are gonna go up on these cameras. You know, $200 for an amazing camera like this is insane. You know, when this camera first came out 16 years ago, I think this camera was around like $6,000, and that's without the inflation. So I don't know. If you're interested, definitely get this camera. There are other versions you can get. Obviously, this is the Canon 1D Mark II. If you want to shoot video with it, you need to get the Canon 1D Mark IV. That's when they started adding video to these cameras, and that is the camera I actually wanted originally, because I did want to try out some video features also. But that camera's around like $1,000, so I didn't want to spend that much money on it, because I just wanted to test it out. But after testing it out, I'm actually tempted to get the Canon 1D Mark IV if I can get a good deal on it. Like if I can get it for around like $500, I might pull the trigger on it. But anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Like I said again at the beginning of the video, I'm kind of busy with the new job I have. but I am gonna try to make more videos for you guys, and I'm gonna be talking about my journey as a salesman, see how that's going, and how I can like turn that sales skills that I'm learning into professional photography to get more clients and hopefully teach you guys. You know, right now I'm only like a month in, so I don't want to like make videos pretend like, oh, I know what I'm talking about. Obviously it's gonna take like a while. I'm probably not gonna be able to talk more about it till like a year. But again, hopefully you guys will subscribe and stick around. But I'll see you guys in the next video. I don't know when it's gonna be. We'll see. Just subscribe and then you'll see it. So get out of here.